The 1960s marked a revolutionary period in Hollywood, filled with dazzling stars and groundbreaking films. But behind the glamour lurked a darker reality, once celebrated directors watching their careers crumble before their eyes. What many don't know is how quickly Hollywood's elite could fall, with single productions capable of destroying decades of hard-earned respect. These aren't just stories of bad movies, they're cautionary tales of ambition, hubris, and spectacular failure that forever changed the landscape of American cinema. Once considered among Hollywood's most talented writer-directors, Robert Rossen's fall from grace culminated in the 1960s after a string of remarkable successes in previous decades. The mastermind behind All the King's Men and The Hustler had established himself as a filmmaker capable of crafting complex moral narratives with commercial appeal. However, his final film, Lilith, 1964, effectively extinguished his once brilliant career flame. Lilith starred Warren Beatty and Gene Seberg in what should have been a compelling psychological drama about mental illness. Instead, the film's disjointed narrative and experimental techniques alienated audiences and critics alike. Columbia Pictures had high expectations based on Rossen's previous successes, making the commercial failure particularly devastating. The studio lost millions on what they'd hoped would be an award season contender. Industry insiders whispered that Rossen's health problems had affected his filmmaking abilities. His directing became erratic during production, with crew members reporting concerning behavior on set. The film's box office performance was so disappointing that Rossen found himself essentially blacklisted from major studio productions. By 1966, he passed away without ever getting another chance to redeem his directorial reputation. What made his downfall particularly tragic was how it contrasted with the artistic integrity that had defined his earlier work. But Rossen's fall was merely the beginning of a decade that would claim many more distinguished careers. Few directors embodied old Hollywood like Henry Hathaway. Having directed Gary Cooper in Lives of a Bengal Lancer and numerous successful film noirs, Hathaway entered the 1960s as a respected veteran. However, the decade would prove merciless to the filmmaker who seemed increasingly out of touch with changing audience tastes. Circus World, 1964, represented Hathaway's first major disaster of the decade. Despite starring John Wayne, the film's bloated production budget and behind-the-scenes drama resulted in a commercial catastrophe. Filmed in Super Technorama 70, the expensive production techniques weren't justified by the lackluster story. Critics dismissed it as a dated spectacle, and audiences stayed away in droves. Paramount executives became increasingly hesitant to work with Hathaway, viewing him as a relic unable to adapt to the cultural revolution sweeping through 1960s America. His methodical, traditional approach felt antiquated compared to the innovative techniques employed by emerging new Hollywood directors. Several planned projects were quietly shelved as studios redirected funds to younger filmmakers, though Hathaway would briefly redeem himself with True Grit, 1969, helping John Wayne secure his only Oscar. The intervening years had been filled with commercial disappointments and professional humiliations. Studio heads regularly questioned his decisions, and younger cast members reportedly found his directing style oppressive. By decade's end, despite the success of True Grit, most industry insiders considered Hathaway's best days long behind him. His reputation as an innovative filmmaker permanently damaged by his 1960s output. The story of Hathaway's decline reveals how quickly Hollywood's shifting cultural tides could leave even established directors struggling to stay relevant. Edward Dmytryk's career trajectory remains one of Hollywood's most fascinating and troubled. Once among the Hollywood 10 who defied the House Un-American Activities Committee, Dmytryk later named names to resurrect his career. This controversial decision allowed him to direct again in the 1950s, but the 1960s exposed the hollowness of his apparent comeback. Where Love Has Gone, 1964, marked the beginning of Dmytryk's creative collapse. Based on Harold Robbins' novel, the film was a thinly veiled exploitation of the Lana Turner, Cheryl Crane scandal. Despite starring Susan Hayward and Bette Davis, the film was derided as tasteless melodrama. Critics savaged its sensationalistic approach, with many questioning how the director of Crossfire and The Caine Mutiny could produce something so artistically banned. Mirage, 1965, followed, with Gregory Peck in an amnesia thriller that confused audiences and underperformed financially. What made Dmytryk's fall particularly stark was the contrast between his thoughtful early work and these increasingly desperate commercial ventures. By 1967, he was directing forgettable war films like Anzio and industry power players considered him creatively exhausted. The final indignity came when Dmytryk, once nominated for a Best Director Oscar, found himself relegated to television work, directing episodes of the Western series Cimarron Strip. His decline symbolized how quickly Hollywood could discard even those directors who had once been considered among its most principled artists. Behind closed doors, studio executives discussed how Dmytryk's compromised personal integrity might have affected his artistic judgment. What awaited other once acclaimed directors would prove equally devastating. Few directors experience as dramatic a reversal of fortune as Anthony Mann. In the 1950s, his psychological westerns with James Stewart revolutionized the genre, establishing Mann as a filmmaker capable of bringing moral complexity to traditionally straightforward stories. His fall would come not through small failures, but through one catastrophic production that effectively ended his A-list status. The Fall of the Roman Empire, 1964, was conceived as an epic historical drama in the tradition of Ben-Hur. With a massive $18 million budget, equivalent to over $150 million today, the film starred Sophia Loren, Stephen Boyd, and Alec Guinness. Shot on enormous sets in Spain, including a 92,000 square foot Roman Forum replica, the largest film set ever constructed at that time, the production's ambition seemed boundless. The film's box office performance was nothing short of catastrophic. Earning only $4.75 million against its massive budget, The Fall of the Roman Empire became one of the decade's most notorious financial disasters. Producer Samuel Bronston's production company went bankrupt, and Mann's reputation suffered irreparable damage. Studio executives privately noted that Mann had lost control of the production, unable to manage the film's sprawling narrative and enormous set pieces. Mann directed only one more film, A Dandy in Aspic, but passed away during production in 1967. The tragedy of Mann's career lies in how his genuine artistic achievements were overshadowed by this single commercial failure. His legacy became defined not by his innovative westerns, but by his contribution to the financial decline of the historical epic genre. While Mann's epic failure claimed his career, other directors faced their own unique professional demises. Few Hollywood stories illustrate the precarious nature of directorial careers better than Joshua Logan's. After directing such 1950s hits as Picnic, Bus Stop, and the massive South Pacific, Logan entered the 1960s as one of Hollywood's most bankable directors. His spectacular fall would come through a series of increasingly disastrous musicals. Camelot, 1967, marked the beginning of the end. Despite starring Richard Harris and Vanessa Redgrave, the Arthurian musical stretched to an indulgent 3 hours production costs, ballooned to $13 million, more than double the original budget. Critics found it ponderous and self-important. With Logan's direction lacking the energy that had characterized his earlier work, Warner Brothers executives were horrified when the film barely recouped its production costs. But the true career killer came with Paint Your Wagon, 1969. The bizarre Western musical starred Lee Marvin and Clint Eastwood, neither known for their singing abilities. The troubled production saw costs explode to $20 million, $150 million in today's dollars, with Logan losing control of both schedule and budget. Stories circulated about his erratic behavior on set, with crew members claiming he seemed overwhelmed by the production's scale. The film became an industry joke, with Eastwood later saying it taught him what not to do as a director. Paint Your Wagon failed commercially and critically, effectively ending Logan's film career. Studio heads who had once courted him now refused his calls. By 1970, the three-time Tony Award winner and Oscar nominee found himself unable to secure directing work in either Hollywood or Broadway. His spectacular downfall illustrated how quickly acclaim could transform into industry exile. The next director's story would prove that even temporary failure could leave permanent career damage. Richard Fleischer entered the 1960s with an impressive and versatile filmography, having directed everything from film noir, The Narrow Margin, to science fiction, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. His reputation for delivering commercially successful films across multiple genres made him a trusted name among studio executives. One film would temporarily derail his promising trajectory. Dr. Dolittle, 1967, began as a calculated attempt to replicate the success of family musicals like Mary Poppins. Starring Rex Harrison fresh off My Fair Lady, the production seemed destined for success. Instead, it became a legendary disaster. Filming in the English countryside was plagued by terrible weather, and Harrison's difficult behavior created constant delays. Animals brought in for filming frequently misbehaved or became ill, requiring expensive replacements. The original $6 million budget ballooned to $18 million, an astronomical sum for the time when finally released. Dr. Dolittle received lukewarm reviews and failed spectacularly at the box office. 20th Century Fox lost approximately $11 million, threatening the studio's financial stability and forcing executives to sell valuable real estate to cover losses. Fleischer's reputation suffered significant damage. Though he would eventually rebuild his career with films like Soylent Green, the immediate aftermath of Dr. Dolittle saw him struggling to secure quality projects. Studio executives who had previously trusted his judgment now questioned his ability to manage large productions. The film's failure demonstrated how even established directors could find themselves professionally compromised by a single high-profile disaster. While Fleischer would eventually recover, others faced more permanent career consequences. Before becoming the acclaimed director of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting in the 1970s, George Roy Hill endured a period of frustration and failure that nearly ended his directing career. His early 1960s work failed to establish him as a distinctive directorial voice, leaving him vulnerable in an increasingly competitive industry. Thoroughly Modern Millie, 1967, exemplified Hill's struggles. Though the film eventually achieved cult status decades later, its initial reception was decidedly mixed. The musical comedy starring Julie Andrews seemed tonally confused, neither fully embracing its period setting as sincere nor committing to parody production costs, exceeded expectations, and Universal executives privately expressed disappointment with Hill's handling of the material. Industry insiders noted how Hill seemed unable to translate his television directing experience to the big screen effectively. Several projects he developed during this period were taken away and reassigned to other directors, a humiliating professional experience. Studio memos from the time reveal concerns about his ability to deliver commercially viable films. What makes Hill's story unusual is his subsequent redemption. Unlike many directors whose 1960s failures permanently derailed their careers, Hill managed to secure the Butch Cassidy assignment that would transform his reputation. His early struggles reveal how precarious directorial careers could be, and how thin the line was between failure and legendary success in Hollywood's volatile creative environment. The next director's decline would prove that even the most charming filmmakers could lose their magic. Few directors seemed as naturally aligned with Hollywood's golden age as Stanley Donen. As co-director of Singin' in the Rain and the creative force behind Funny Face and Charade, Donen's visual flair and innate sense of entertainment had defined cinematic elegance in the 1950s. The 1960s would challenge his seemingly unassailable reputation. Arabesque, 1966, showcased Donen's increasing creative struggles. Despite starring Gregory Peck and Sophia Loren, the convoluted thriller received criticism for prioritizing style over coherent storytelling. Though visually innovative, the film's narrative shortcomings suggested Donen was losing touch with audience expectations. Universal executives were disappointed when the expensive production barely broke. Even Donen's most significant failure came with Staircase, 1969, a drama starring Richard Burton and Rex Harrison as an aging gay couple. While groundbreaking in subject matter, the film's uncomfortable blend of humor and pathos confused audiences, and its marketing campaign proved disastrous. 20th Century Fox buried the release, and the film lost millions. Industry insiders whispered that Donen had completely misread the cultural moment. Though Donen would direct occasionally in subsequent decades, his career never fully recovered from these 1960s disappointments. Studio executives increasingly viewed him as a director whose sensibilities belonged to an earlier era. By decade's end, the filmmaker once considered among Hollywood's most reliable talents struggled to secure financing for his increasingly personal projects, marking a sad coda to what had been a joyous cinematic career. But even Donen's decline paled compared to the fall of one of cinema's most provocative auteurs. Otto Preminger had built his reputation as a fearless filmmaker willing to challenge Hollywood's moral restrictions. Films like The Man with the Golden Arm and Anatomy of a Murder broke significant ground in depicting previously forbidden subjects. By the mid-1960s, however, Preminger's provocative approach had curdled into something audiences increasingly rejected. Hurry Sundown, 1967, represented a spectacular misstep. The racially charged Southern drama was criticized for its stereotypical characterizations and exploitative approach to serious themes. African American characters were portrayed with cringe-inducing simplicity, and Michael Caine's performance with an exaggerated Southern accent became a source of industry ridicule. Production was plagued by tensions between Preminger and his cast, with reports of the director's tyrannical behavior creating a toxic atmosphere. But it was Skidoo, 1968, that cemented Preminger's fall from grace. This bizarre attempt to capture counterculture sensibilities featured Jackie Gleason taking LSD and Groucho Marx as a mob boss named God. The film's psychedelic sequences and disjointed narrative suggested Preminger had completely lost touch with both filmmaking trends and audience tastes. Paramount essentially buried the release, and critics delivered savage reviews questioning the director's sanity. Preminger's autocratic directing style, once tolerated when delivering hits, became his undoing as failures mounted. Actors increasingly refused to work with him, citing his abusive on-set behavior. By decade's end, the filmmaker, once known for boundary-pushing content, found himself struggling for industry relevance. His name no longer synonymous with artistic courage, but with artistic confusion. As Preminger's star fell, another legendary director was experiencing his own painful decline. Few American directors had achieved the artistic heights of Elia Kazan. The force behind On the Waterfront, A Streetcar Named Desire, and East of Eden, Kazan had fundamentally shaped American cinema and theater. His controversial HUAC testimony had made him a polarizing industry figure, but his artistic credentials remained impeccable. Until the 1960s revealed his diminishing creative powers. The Arrangement, 1969, exemplified Kazan's late career struggles. Based on his own novel, the film starred Kirk Douglas in a story exploring middle-age disillusionment and infidelity. What should have been an intimate character study became a bloated, self-indulgent exercise. Critics noted the film's heavy-handed symbolism and dated psychological approach, suggesting Kazan had lost touch with evolving cinematic language. Warner Brothers executives were alarmed by the film's poor test screenings, but hesitated to challenge the legendary director. When released, The Arrangement failed both critically and commercially. Industry observers noted how Kazan's once revolutionary realism now seemed theatrical and affected compared to the work of emerging directors influenced by European cinema. The painful reality was that Kazan, once America's most culturally relevant filmmaker, had become creatively obsolete. Though his earlier contributions remained unquestioned, studio heads increasingly viewed him as a director whose methods and sensibilities belonged to a different era. By the 1970s, Kazan struggled to secure financing even as directors. He had influence-dominated American cinema, marking one of Hollywood's most significant creative declines. But perhaps no 1960s directorial fall was as financially catastrophic as the next filmmakers. George Stevens had directed some of Hollywood's most beloved classics, Shane, Giant, and A Place in the Sun, winning 2 Best Director Oscars in the process. His meticulous approach and visual sophistication had established him as perhaps America's most respected filmmaker. One disastrous production would forever alter his legendary status. The Greatest Story Ever Told, 1965, began as an ambitious religious epic, Stevens' personal passion project about the life of Jesus Christ United Artists, granted him unprecedented creative control and a massive budget that eventually reached $20 million, equivalent to approximately $170 million today. The production became notorious for Stevens' perfectionism, with simple scenes requiring dozens of takes and schedule delays becoming routine. Stevens cast Swedish actor Max von Sydow as Jesus, but undermined the film's authenticity by including distracting cameos from Hollywood stars like John Wayne as a Roman centurion who famously drawled, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." The final cut stretched to over 4 hours, with Stevens refusing significant edits despite studio pleas. The box office results were catastrophic. The Greatest Story Ever Told earned only $8 million against its enormous budget, making it one of the decade's biggest financial disasters. United Artists executives were devastated. with the failure contributing to a larger financial crisis at the studio. Stevens' reputation never recovered from the debacle. Once considered America's most bankable, prestigious director, he found himself unable to secure financing for subsequent projects. Stevens directed only one more film before his death, the critically dismissed The Only Game in Town, 1970. His spectacular fall illustrated how completely one failure could erase decades of success in Hollywood's unforgiving environment, but the final director's story would prove the most financially devastating of all. Joseph L. Mankiewicz entered the 1960s as Hollywood royalty. The writer-director behind All About Eve and Letter to Three Wives had won 4 Oscars and was renowned for his sophisticated dialogue and narrative ingenuity. His involvement with one troubled production would nearly destroy both his career and an entire movie studio. Cleopatra, 1963, began as a relatively modest historical drama before spiraling into what was then the most expensive film ever made, originally budgeted at $2 million. Costs eventually ballooned to an unprecedented $44 million, $375 million in today's dollars. Production chaos included sets built in England that had to be abandoned and rebuilt in Italy when Elizabeth Taylor became ill, requiring a location change to a warmer climate. Mankiewicz found himself in an impossible situation, brought in to replace director Ruben Mamoulian and forced to rewrite the script while shooting had already begun. The pressure was immense, with Mankiewicz reportedly working 20-hour days rewriting scenes the night before filming. The off-screen romance between Taylor and Richard Burton created a media circus that further complicated production. The film's troubled journey to the screen nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox, forcing the studio to sell its backlot, now the site of Century City in Los Angeles, to cover debts. Though Cleopatra eventually turned a small profit through re-releases, the initial financial panic permanently damaged Mankiewicz's standing in the industry. Studio executives blamed his inability to control costs and the production schedule. Mankiewicz directed only 3 more films in the following decade, none approaching his earlier work's quality or success. The man, once considered America's most literate filmmaker, found himself struggling for financing, his name forever associated with Hollywood's most notorious production disaster. The spectacular falls from grace experienced by these 12 directors reveal how quickly fortunes could change in 1960s Hollywood. These weren't simply filmmakers who made bad movies. They were acclaimed artists whose reputations were damaged or destroyed by high-profile failures, changing audience tastes, and their own creative limitations. Their stories serve as stark reminders of the entertainment industry's ruthless nature, where yesterday's genius can become tomorrow's cautionary tale. Perhaps the most sobering lesson is how completely these once celebrated names faded from cultural memory, proving that in Hollywood, even legendary status offers no protection against professional extinction.